Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Inside Politics on Time Television. I'm your host, Ali Najmi, and today we have a very special guest, Assemblyman Charles Lavine from Long Island. Assemblyman Lavine, thanks for being on.
It's my great pleasure, and salam alaikum.
Thank you. Assemblyman Lavine, we're so happy to have you. We saw some really very interesting news that came out from your end about wanting to rename Donald Trump Park, which is a park that exists in New York State, bearing the name of Donald Trump, who most recently put out some very Islamophobic statements calling for the ban of Muslims who are immigrating to America. And in fact, you had suggested renaming the park after Peter Salam, who is a Revolutionary War hero that is also Muslim.
Who is, some would say, largely unknown, although he is not unknown at all. And it's important for us as Americans to reflect on the fact that we are all in this together. That's the brilliance of America. America has never been just one kind of person. From the earliest days of the European settlers, America was inhabited by the first Americans, and they were diverse, and they had different nationalities. It's never just been for one single type of person. And in fact, Peter Salam, who fought in the Revolutionary War at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he also fought in New York at the Battle of Saratoga and at the Battle of Stony Point, was a Muslim. But Muslims have fought in all the wars that America has waged, from the Revolutionary War through the Civil War, through World War I and Second World War, and we are very proud of the fact
it's a very powerful proposal. It's a very powerful proposal. I actually had not even heard of Peter Salam until I read about your bill or your suggestion, and I think it's very symbolic for people to see that the founding of this country included Muslims.
Well, Salam fought at the Battle of Stony Point. Stony Point is only about 20 miles away from so-called Trump State Park.
I see.
Which is, many of us have passed. It's right off the Taconic as you head north outside New York City.
Right. Well, how do you think that's going? I know, what was the reaction from Donald Trump?
I don't suspect that Mr. Trump was terribly pleased about it, but it's going very well. We have a tremendous amount of support from everyone, and I know that it's getting some serious consideration in the New York State Department of
Well,
Parks.
I know your suggestion touched a lot of people in the community. I know institutions like the Muslim Democratic Club and people who are watching the show tonight were very inspired to see somebody like you step up at one of the most trying times for Muslim Americans to make this suggestion. So thank you for doing that.
Well, it is my great pleasure and my great honor, and I don't think I'd be fulfilling my responsibility as an American if I did not do that. America is not about hate. America is about diversity. It is our strength.
What would be your advice to Muslim American community, in New York or nationally? What do you think would be the best way to respond to Trump's vitriol and increasing Islamophobia that comes from it?
I think the Muslim American community has responded. I think leaders of the American Muslim community have made the case that Muslims have every much as much right to be Americans as do I as a Jew, or my friends who are Christian, or my friends who are Sikh or Hindu. We celebrate the great freedoms in America, and it's not that long ago that President Franklin Roosevelt defined those freedoms to include freedom of religion. And woe be unto him or her who decides to single out any American for their faith. That's not what we're about.
It's really that's exactly well said, and it's not a new political tactic. It's not even one that's uniquely American. I mean, people will unfortunately wield identity in very negative, destructive ways, and people will point to a boogeyman or other somebody to rile up a crowd. Right? It's happened. Some of the worst parts of American history have been that way. Do you think it's working for Donald?
It's working for him to a certain extent. And even though it's uncomfortable for us to listen to his demagoguery and this needless vitriol, it's important that in a free society, people who have that attitude have the right to express it.
Right.
They have the right to be stupid. It's part of the, it's not defined in our Constitution, but it lets the rest of us know who they are and how they operate and how they think, and it keeps them from going underground, because it's when people go underground and this hate festers that we end up with infinitely greater problems. Now, I was sort of fortunate, and I'll share this with you, as a younger person, although I didn't view it as being fortunate at the time. I was one of the very few Jews who lived where I grew up in the upper Midwest, and there were times where I know, as a matter of fact, I was the only Jewish kid in a high school in the entire Upper Peninsula of Michigan.
Really?
And so I would hear things, and I was at times the subject of this sort of antagonism. So I learned, I learned what hate is about. And it's tough to define, if we use words, simple words, who is a hater and who is not a hater. Today, those who engage in this kind of conduct that Trump engages in are a little more subtle, a little more sophisticated than they were during the time my father was a young man, when there was much more overt racial and religious hatred. But those of us who have experienced this hate have a visceral sense. We perhaps couldn't define it with words, but we know who the haters are.
Right.
And Mr. Trump is taking full advantage of his ability to demagogue and to stir hatreds.
Right.
And as a consequence, there's no reason for the state of New York to enable his hatred by having his name on a public park. That's not what New Yorkers are all about.
Right. So you've introduced the bill, right? Is it going to get voted on this session? Or?
It very well may. The governor's office itself may decide through the Department of Parks to take some action.
Executive action to do it.
To do this. So
so we may get something.
It's not only a good thing, it's the right thing to do. And I will forever be proud for my children and my grandchildren that they will know that their father and their grandfather did this.
Well, yes, wow, thank you. And I know you just recently had another grandchild, so congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Can you tell us a little bit about your family? I know your son very well through his work in Queens politics and with the Congresswoman Meng.
Yes.
But I understand you just had a second grandchild.
Well, we're very proud of both our children, and our son had worked for Congressional Representative Meng and for City Council member Karen Koslowitz, two of the great people in government. And my daughter is a social worker, and she lives in Oakland, California. And I'm very proud to report and announce that late on Sunday night, the last day of January, she delivered a very beautiful little baby girl.
Wonderful.
Named Casey Lee Cockrell Lavine.
Mazel tov.
Thank you.
So, there's been a lot going on. You've been in the Assembly, I think, since 2004, so well over a decade now, 12 years. You were started your career under then Speaker Sheldon Silver, who, this year or just last year, unfortunately went down in one of the largest corruption scandals in New York State history. As a resident of this state, it was really embarrassing to have both the Speaker of the Assembly and the Majority Leader of the State Senate arrested basically at the same time. And it was a stain on New York's political image. What do you think is going to, how is Albany now? How is the Assembly now? Do you think that there are enough controls in place to prevent that from happening again?
I think that one of the things we have seen over the course of the last 5 or 6 years that is making a difference is that the United States Attorney's Office is investigating more and more what goes on in the state capitol. For many years, there seemed to be a tacit understanding, almost unspoken understanding, that the prosecutors and the police would not be looking into the workings of political people. But over the course of the last few years, we have seen many people charged and indicted. And as a matter of fact, in the 12 years that I have been there, one of the reasons I've been able to rise in the ranks of seniority so relatively rapidly is because of the convictions of so many people who had greater seniority than I did. Now that's a little bit of a joke, but it is a great embarrassment. And I had published a piece in the New York Times about a month ago on steps that the legislature itself can take to change things.
We'd love to hear about them. I know you're the chair of the Ethics Committee, which is, so this is completely within your leadership here. Tell us about what needs to happen going forward.
Well, one of the reasons that not only the leaders of the Assembly and Senate in New York State, but the leaders of many state legislatures have been indicted and convicted is that, simply speaking, they have too much power and not enough people are looking over their shoulders.
Right.
So our legislative calendar, our schedule, keeps us in Albany for basically half the year, from January until the third week of June. Now, this schedule is agreed upon by the leaders of the Senate and the Assembly. This is not a constitutional matter. There's no constitutional requirement that the Assembly and Senate be discharged in the third week of June. So what happens effectively is that during those 5.5 months or so, or 6 months, we are in Albany a total this year of about 56 legislative days. That's not a lot. So what occurs then is this. For the half a year that we are not there, the powers of the Speaker of the Assembly and the Majority Leader of the Senate, and the governor for that matter, are artificially enhanced. Because as long as we aren't there to be looking over the shoulder of the Speaker or the Majority Leader and bothering them and questioning them, they have free rein. This is not the way government is supposed to function. Our budget is nearly $150 billion. We've got 20 million people in New York State. We have the geographic equivalent of many countries, and yet we function with a 19th century model of a legislature. It doesn't work anymore. We don't need to have our senators and assembly representatives back home on the farm, the gentlemen farmers back home on the farm at the end of summer for the harvest. Today there's only a handful of us, myself included, who know one end of a cow from the other end of a cow. We need to have a 21st century approach.
We got to take a short break. We're going to be right back here on Inside Politics. Welcome back to Inside Politics. We're here with Assemblyman Charles Lavine. Assemblyman, just before the break, we were discussing the corruption scandals and what needs to be done. You had just suggested one item, including the calendar and the empowerment of other assembly members.
We need a full-time legislature. We need a full-time legislature where the members of the Assembly and the Senate owe their allegiance solely to the people of the state of New York. That means no outside work. That which is a great cause of conflict of interest.
Now, you yourself are an attorney. You had a law practice for a very long time. I understand that you stopped taking cases. Tell me about that. When did you stop? Was it right when you got in, or?
Yes, I took on no new cases. Although I think I did go to a traffic court with a friend, but I didn't. That was pretty much. I'm going to say that was pretty much pro bono. That was beyond pro bono. No, I didn't get paid. I didn't get paid for that.
Well, that's a really big, bold move. I mean, and I think the Assembly maybe. I think last time I checked, it was like a third of the members were attorneys or something like that, or some others have other professions, and with Sheldon Silver, one of the biggest issues was he was essentially taking bribes through his law office or his legal business.
A sad end to what would have otherwise been a very distinguished career.
That's correct. That is actually that is very true. So it must have been a very difficult decision at that time, 12 years ago, to stop taking cases. Probably take a pay cut because this assembly salary is not very lucrative. It's $79,000, especially when your other colleagues didn't do that. So we commend you for taking that bold step.
Well, thank you. But in truth, and I'm not supposed to say that. That's a bad thing for a politician to say. My wife was working at the time. She was a teacher, but she retired about 5 or 6 years ago. So we're fortunate that we have some money that was put aside, and we have her pension. Sure. And I am old enough to get Social Security, and this all helps.
So if we did full-time legislature, should we increase the salary?
To some extent, yes.
Yeah. What do you think would be appropriate?
You know, I don't know. I don't know whether it should be the same as the congressional representatives get.
Which is 160.
I mean, the fact of the matter is that the members of the legislature in New York who will be working full-time will be doing as much work as many of our colleagues in the United States House of Representatives and Senate do. So it ought to be some sort of a fair and equitable salary.
Is full-time really the answer? Because even if this was income that they weren't really allowed to make to begin with. It was not just income; it was a bribe, right? You could, whether it comes to someone through a legal referral or a bogus legal account, or it comes in an envelope under the table. There's still something else that needs to be done, isn't there?
I think if we're speaking specifically about the former speaker and the former majority leader, we may be missing the overall problem. The overall problem is that the people of the state of New York deserve and need a full-time legislature. Our legislative schedule is such that January, February, and March are entirely consumed with budgetary negotiations because the budget is due by the end of March, April the 1st. For the 20 years before I ran in a contested primary against a sitting member of the Assembly, we had not had a budget on time. I had been involved with trying to get school budgets passed in my home community of Glen Cove. That became increasingly difficult because by the time we would go to a vote in May, we would have no idea, because there wasn't a state budget, what's the state share of the funding going to be. There was tremendous cynicism about this. Now, for people who live in New York City, it's a very different experience in terms of the funding of public education. But for those of us who live on Long Island, and there are 124 separate school districts on Long Island, in 2004, about 40% of them were defeated because people had just given up. No one knew what we were getting from the state of New York. It's the state's responsibility to help fund public education. It was an entire exercise in cynicism. So we need to have a full-time legislature because the first 3 months entirely consumed with the budget. That leaves us a total of about 10 weeks. At the end of this term, there will be over 10,000 bills pending in the New York State Assembly and at least a couple thousand pending in the New York State Senate. There is no way, realistically, for us to approach that quantity of work in 10 weeks. It's impossible. The people deserve more, and the people of the state need more. And in addition to that, in the 12 years I've been in the Assembly, we have seen crises develop when we're not in session. We've seen great storms hit upstate New York in late autumn, and there's no legislative response. That's not what governance is supposed to be. We're supposed to have some measure of faith in our government. That means we need a modern government, and it also means we need a government that is not led by criminals.
Now, I mean, recruiting candidates, having an even playing field during elections is very important to what the legislature will look like. Campaign finance reform is a big topic, both locally and nationally. In the city, we have a campaign finance board with a matching system that makes it easier for grassroots candidates to have enough money to run a race. We don't have that on the state level. Do you think we should?
100%. I think publicly funding of campaigns is essential to the democratic process. Why should we leave it solely to people who have tremendous amounts of money of their own to run for these offices? Why should we leave it to people who are going to be underwritten heavily by special interests, special corporate interests?
And you can take a corporate check in a state race. You can't do that in a city race
Precisely.
or an LLC check.
No. And as the old expression goes, you got to dance with the people who brung you to the ball. There's a great danger in corporate financing of public elections.
Well, do you
which
think
is
we'll
what
get
we've
there
done.
ever in Albany to get publicly financed elections?
We will get there. You know, I'm a great fan, not with everything he did, but a great fan of Winston Churchill. And as opposed to many of my colleagues who love to talk about Churchill, I actually like to read Churchill. He was a magnificent writer with a phenomenal command of the English language. Didn't make him a saint. A lot of the things he did were no good at all. But he used to say this about the Americans, and he had a unique ability to know this because he had visited America many times. His mother was American, Jenny Jerome of Jerome Avenue fame in the Bronx, and he used to say this about the Americans. He'd say, and I'm not going to do it in Churchill's voice, but he'd say, you know, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing, but only after all else has failed. Right. So we've been failing for a long time, and the Citizens United case coming from the Supreme Court has only made matters all the worse. I'll give you an interesting example of some of the dangers that we face. I spent the last couple of weeks in Oakland, California, where my daughter lives. Richmond, California is right next to Oakland. It's just north. Chevron has refineries in Richmond. About 4 or 5 years ago, those refineries blew up. Mm-hmm. There was terrible damage to the city of Richmond, which is a struggling city to begin with. The local public officials decided to pursue a lawsuit against Chevron. Chevron then decided to finance candidates to run for city council and mayor against the incumbents. Wow. And guess who won? The party with the deepest pockets. So now there's a new government in the city of Richmond that will probably, or at least the fear is, that they're going to decide to discontinue the lawsuit.
Probably will.
It is a scary time.
You know, it's tough to raise money. And I could see a lot of pressures on, you know, there's been a lot of talk about campaign finance reform. There's been a lot of talk about closing the LLC loophole. Some of the same people talking about that, if you look at their most recent campaign finance filing, are taking LLC money.
Yes.
Are still exploiting the loopholes that perhaps we should be closing, that they're saying should be closed. Do you think it will happen in this session?
I doubt very much it will happen in this session. It may happen, if it happens at all, and I think it will happen. The political complexion or composition / complexion of the state senate will have to change.
Well, definitely will change, right?
Over time, it is going to change. We need, and now I'm going to make this political.
Sure.
We need a state senate that is far more responsive to the needs of the everyday working families of the state of New York.
Well, now there's an open seat in Long Island, Dean Skelos' seat, which does it overlap with you at all?
No, it does not. But it's near where I live, and I'm very familiar with the
right. So I think for
area.
Some of our viewers, if they live, I believe, at Valley Stream, Elmont,
Long Beach, Atlantic Beach, all the communities on the South Shore.
There's a growing South Asian community, at least in the Elmont Valley Stream area. So they're going to have an election. Is it going to be a special, or is it going to be a primary?
It's going to be April the 19th. I don't think there's going to be a primary on the Democratic side. However, there are several people, I'm trying to think, on the Republican side. I don't think there'll be a primary. It's going to be a special. I don't think there'll be a primary.
It's going to be party dominated.
So there are two good people who are running. Chris McGrath, who is a lawyer, is running for the Republicans, has not been in public office before. He's a very fine man. I know him. I consider him a friend. And Todd Kaminsky, a former federal prosecutor.
Attorney, just got there, though.
And yes, is running on the Democratic side. It should be a good election.
Right.
The demographic, the Democrats outnumber Republicans in that particular district. So this could be a game changer.
I mean, it's such a thin balance of power in the state senate.
Yes.
Getting back to raising money, somebody very prominent in New York's politics and national politics, Steve Israel, who's my congressman, I believe also your congressman, is decided not to run for re-election. And in our last minute, I just wanted to touch on this point. I read something he put in the New York Times talking about how grueling fundraising can be and how overwhelming, and it's just like all you wind up doing. With that said, he's thrown in the towel. It's an open seat in June. Any thoughts on running for Congress?
I'm giving it some consideration. My name was mentioned as one of the people who was going to give it some consideration in the New York Times and Newsday. And it's kind of flattering to think that a kid from the middle of nowhere, no longer a kid, in the Midwest could come to New York and establish himself as a viable politician who some people have great trust in. But we have to remember that New York is the land of upward mobility,
right.
And it actually is, compared to many of the other states, not to mention any specifically, but Texas is just the opposite. So I'm giving it serious consideration, and I've spoken to a lot of people, and we'll see what the next days hold in store.
Well, I know I'm just, me personally, we'd love to see you there, and actually we'll have the opportunity to vote in that election, so you can count on me. And we want to thank you again for coming on, Assemblyman Lavine. It's been great to have you, and I want to thank everybody for tuning in tonight to watch us here on Inside Politics at Time Television. Thank you.